Hey folks, Nick Tockert here with the Historical Fencing Guild. Before we get into today's program, we've got a couple bills to pay and we'll get right into that. So first and foremost, we want to put a huge shout out to our good friends over at IndieCD.org. Yes, IndieCD.org, your one-stop shop for the best and the brightest authors, artists, musicians, basically anyone who you could use to help make your dreams happen can be found there. And if you are an independent creator looking for a place to be hosted, consider joining IndieCD.org. For a low cost of $40, you get a lifetime membership, tech support. You'll be hosted online in a group of other creators that, because they're all there, everybody's promoting it. And you'll have access to a social media network solely for those creators to be able to exchange ideas and references about conventions that are coming up, opportunities, etc. We also have a calendar of events that talks about conventions that will, may be in your area. Basically, if you're going to a convention, you put it up in the calendar of events, and then other people can find out, oh, there's a convention there. That's within my drive, range. Let's make that work. It's a very neat thing to be a part of. I'm proud to be a member. And in the description, you'll find a link to them where I get a little kickback. Now, because I understand that 40 is a big ask, I am going to let you in on a little secret. If you go to the first podcast that the Independent Creator Directory put out, you'll be able to get the code that will take you to half price. So that code would be, on podcast 1. I need to say that clearly so it's in maybe all capital letters. Podcast 1. So that would make it only $20, but that's if you're paying attention. Use my link, and I get a little bit of money kicked back that I can use to help keep the guild going. And the good folks at IndieCD actually are responsible in part. Well, actually, they're covering the StreamYard subscription, so I can broadcast. Right now, I am broadcasting to Facebook, YouTube, and Twitter, and we can take comments from all three of those places, or X. You guys know what I'm talking about. We'll be happy to take any questions, comments, whatever you have on the menu tonight. We're also made possible by sales of my books, and all my books, including The Simple Sword, The Fighting Axe, and The Simple Spear, all part of my ongoing, with my phone, ongoing series of fencing manuals designed to take you from having never handled a sword, going all the way up to being able to teach it to others. From here, you will get simple English and stick figures designed to make it approachable. I work on this from a perspective of being adaptive. And pardon me, my settings are a little off, I realize, because I am hung back here. I'll just fix that. There we go. That's much better. Our topics for today that have been discussed is there was a request for a minor discussion on medieval archery. So we will try to get into archery throughout the period a little bit. There was a really great conversation came through my direct messenger asking what order of weapons should people train in. So what should they know how to use, and in what order should they probably start training them? And the order can, move depending on your intentions and things. Sorry, I've got something updating in the background. So pardon that, a little bit of computer maintenance. The other thing, so we'll go over the types of weapons, both the things you need to know. We'll go from personal training on out. And that does overlap with archery a bit because, well, we'll explain that. And then if we have time in the hour, maybe we'll extend to some gear reviews. We'll check out if anything's on sale at PHA, Purple Heart Armory, my preferred vendor. I haven't seen anything too snazzy on Amazon lately, but there are a couple things that tempt me. We may go discussing that. And as always, anything I have planned will be interrupted by any questions or comments you guys have, because I want to be able to serve the people who are here. If you are watching, please be willing to comment, talk about it. If you have any questions, whatever you think, as long as you're civil, please, I want to hear from you. Now, there is a group of people I have to thank that make this possible, make me able to afford, and excuse my mess, but afford the trainers that I review, the gear, the materials I do. And that's my patrons over on Patreon. And they're listed at the bottom right now. So that's Off in the Woods, Frog G, Ronald Rain, A Bladed Thesis, ignore the hard to pronounce name, Brian K. Morris, Cindy Kep, and Steve Augusto. These wonderful folks give freely of themselves, and they get about a bi-weekly update letter, weekly to bi-weekly, depending on what's going on. They get first crack at what topics they want me to talk about. I will be actually going through their request list as my rearrangements of certain things make it available, to check off the list of videos that you guys have said you want to see. So I will be, hopefully in the very near future, as I complete some other projects, because I'm building up for a convention in Fowler, Indiana, February 24th. It is free to the public. It is a author convention and creatives. You're more than welcome to come. It is at the Purdue Extension Building, right off of 52. It's a little off 52 on Amway, or the Amway, if you're from the region. Please come by. We'll have, I think we've got 10 great vendors, plus one of them is going to be putting out swag and discussions for the people who couldn't make it to the event. It's a very small site, and we'll go from there. All right? But before I get into anything else, let's talk and do some greetings. And first through the door is, of course, the StreamYard click one, because that's the wrong one, is actually Miss Saren. Good evening. Good evening, Miss Saren. It's always good to see you in the chat. Please fire away. And Foxy says, evening, everyone. And Thesis wades right in with always start with the staff. And we will talk about that, because the staff is a very interesting place when it comes, very interesting, it has an interesting place in weapons training. And we have to talk about some things, because there's some misconceptions that are held about medieval training. But it looks like nobody's making any extra comments, so I'm going to get right into it. Now, as Thesis said, well, always start with the staff. That is a proud tradition in both Western and Eastern systems, but not always true, in that we want to go to what do you need to start. And most individuals who are of a martial background, either they are, family of men at arms, they're trained by the people, they're living in a castle, people who are expected to know the stuff early, most of your nobles and things, long before they'd go to a sword master to be taught any weapon, or weapons master, depending on who you're talking to, and the terms float around. I like these because they're fairly generic. They had to learn a lot of things beforehand. And that is partially why they're not in a lot of manuals. Basically, from childhood, they would learn types of wrestling, okay? And that might vary dramatically between household, but types of wrestling. Probably, again, start with a staff and a single stick is where a lot of this is going to begin. And we'll talk about the staff, because the staff is on the list of manuals I need to write, but it has to be very carefully done. So that learn to fight, learn to move, usually start learning to dance. And yes, all the way through the Middle Ages, learning to dance is crucial because if you look at it, and it's not something that's discussed, but it's something I've noticed. Uh, Medieval dances, many of them were group dances. Okay, it wasn't anything like when we think of when we say dances, we think of people coupling off and waltzes and all this. No, most of it was folk dances and ring dances, and then weaving through each other dances. I can't remember what the suicide dance is called. It's not trench war, the kamikaze dance. Yeah, where lines are weaving through and people are ducking and dodging, and there's very distinct rhythms to it. This is all very much fun. They would learn this as children, and of course into their teens and out during their courting days. But it also serves some very practical purposes that I don't think anybody's pieced together. When they learned to dance that kind of dance, they were learning basic group movements. To dance, you have to know which is your left foot, which is your right foot. You have to be able to keep yourself centered, moving rapidly back and forth. You have to be able to judge distances. So when people think about a period, either Renaissance or medieval, while the dances change, the practicality in learning what seems entirely frivolous, being these lovely dances, is evident in what you need to know. Because you have to remember, this was the time of tight formation training. And it was necessary because of, amongst other things, coordination and simple communication over distance is much harder to do, to give orders to a group with and have them presented all the way across. That gets into the importance of music in period all the way through till the end of line combat, which I would say probably Civil War is basically the last part of really focused line combat. Uh, American Civil War. I'm biased on American, I admit it freely. But yeah, I think by then they've broken down to understanding guerrilla tactics and warfare and shifted dramatically. And we're joined by Kitty. Hello, Kitty. I think being a dancer before thesis started training was a huge help. Absolutely. I completely concur. I love training with dancers. That's why I have the questions that I ask when I am working with somebody who's never held a sword before. And yes, many times in period, everybody learned the staff. And there are practical reasons for that. One, staff or staff like objects are aplenty, especially in this time. Two, they're very, very cheap to acquire. You get a sturdy sapling, you cut it down, get the shape you want, shave it a bit, and you've got a very nice walking staff that you can then use, combatively. Three, compared to edged weapons, of course, staff is much safer because you don't have a cutting edge. I mean, you can still fairly easily kill somebody with a staff if you either know what you're doing, get lucky, or make a very bad mistake. Not ever dismissing that. You're talking to a guy who favors the Joe staff as a training concept, which is an odd one. But given my necessity and predilection towards I'm sorry, I got a pneumonia shot while I was at the doctor, and it's quite sore, so I'm having to work it to keep it from tensing up and getting worse. I should have done more of this, but I had projects. So I'm sorry, I got distracted. By working with by building from a group support, you learn through dancing, group dances, and even line dances today, which I know many people who aren't country fans are appalled by. But think about it, that's organized, uniform movement. You have to all make the same distant steps. You have to know where your people are, so that when you're fighting in a line and you're holding a shield wall. The Sorry, let me get her comment. And ribbon dancing helped me get used to weapons like my rope dart. And see, ribbon dancing and what you do is, and most of what a lot of the Eastern styles I see taught are single person combatives. What I mean, they are not meant to be used in close quarters with other people. This is why a lot of the weapons people prefer to train that they think are very cool, actually, once you start getting into the kind of combat the vast majority of people would encounter, aren't as practical. So we have to look at practicality. And from the practicality, we'll look at, depending on where your rank was, you got to learn different things. So I have a lot I'm keeping in my head right now. Getting back, you do the dance to learn how to move and move with people. You learn basic, at least basic hand to hand, both from just old fashioned fisticuffs, because people pick that up, and dirty fighting, depending again on your situation. If you're urban, you're going to learn dirty fighting fast. And that's the other thing about the weapons you learn. The weapons you start off with are going to be the weapons you're likely to have access to. What do I mean? If you are rural, if you live out in the country, you're a farmer, you are going to know the beginnings of a couple weapons long before you really think about it. So you're going to learn the tool version of knife use. You're going to learn essentially machete. You're going to use hand axes and full axes basically constantly, because you have to break down the wood you acquire. It's a little different than now, because many times they could only take deadfall, but still, understanding how to operate a timber axe and other farm implements is going to greatly influence what you can fight when you are conscripted into a army. Because remember, there's a lot of constriction now. So you're not going to come at it with the lack of physical education that we have today. And I know that sounds rather dramatic and perhaps a little harsh, but except for people who live in fairly rural areas and may choose to maintain specific lifestyles, we live at a time where most people have, never used a knife for anything other than food prep. And a great many people, even then, have only used a knife to cut up already prepared food. So the most rudimentary uses of a knife. It's been attempted to be phased out of our society. But you get a more country life, anybody who's had to deal with firewood, you're going to learn knife, you're going to learn axe, you're going to learn staff, because you're walking around and a walking stick makes travel easier. And you're going to learn archery, especially in England, because England made it mandatory to have archery practice, at least weekly, to the point where it was understood that on Sundays they would go to church, do the services, and then after church go out and practice obscene amounts of archery. To the point where when you look at the skeletons, there's actual deformation in the bones and certainly in the musculature of people from that period, from anchoring bows and shooting. by working them differently, you have different results. I pride myself in being ambidextrous in most things. I am not to be ambidextrous unless it's an emergency situation in most poundages of bows, because the damage to my right wrist is such that compression on my right wrist is damaging to me. So it makes much more sense to have the bow in my left hand, anchor from the right. And even though I'm more comfortably um, left eye dominant, and after you shoot a lot, you lose that, and you start doing what's called instinctual archery, where you're not aiming down the arrow, you're not worried about that. You're looking at what you're aiming at, and you'll be able to send it without really worrying about aiming because you've done it so many times. So you have this, and this gives you food, this gives you defense against, brigands or whatever, and it gives you part of your job because the military expects you to be able to do that. Cool. So likely you know your way around if you're rural, all that stuff. If you are urban, you're urban people in the Middle Ages tended to be that's how you shoot. I've never sighted down an arrow. And that's the difference between how I shoot and how like the Boy Scouts teach and stuff. Archery, I learned a lot by doing a lot of shooting. I used to do a lot of archery. I did a lot of air gun stuff. Sorry if you heard Xander talking to Boots, but and that's okay because he's being nice. We so that was part of it. You split wood. You used sorted farm implements like scythes and essentially a dussock / a farm knife. A farm knife was basically a machete, oftentimes with an angle off the side. So I'm going to say it again, and I'm going to offend some people. The most popular sword in the world is not the katana, it's the machete. And the machete straddles that line between is it a long knife or a short sword? I'm going to say for practical use, machete and variants of machete, absolute end all. So one of the earliest weapon uses of swords, one of sword and sword-like objects, still in practical use today, understanding machetes. So, okay, that means a lot of muscles, they come into training from a rural setting, a lot of musculature. Now let's look at the urban setting. You may or have a limited version of a lot of what I said. Yeah, some axes, some you're more likely to have hammers because you're more likely to have craftsman jobs. So you have a blacksmith. The blacksmith can make a hammer go. A tanner, because you're going to learn a lot of this from your family or from apprenticeships. Remember, your job was your last name very often. That's why archer is still a name. That's why Smith is such a prevalent name, because it used to be this Smith or that. Thatcher. Thatching is the straw covering of roofs. So thatchers were the people who put the roofs on period cottages. And I'm keeping to English history quite a bit because it's where I'm most comfortable. But I'm going to cross into European as it pops up. More continental, and then farther over. This is the skill sets ahead. The other thing is, if you were more impoverished and or more criminal, you became very handy with a knife. Knives and daggers, but leaning more towards knives, were very necessary, popular things to make go for self-defense. And if you lived in that kind of setting, the brutality basically didn't. It hasn't stopped, but urban fighting brutality is very aggressive, very fast because to get in, bang bang, do whatever they're doing, take your stuff and get out, or bang bang, you're getting ambushed. You have to fight them off and get away. For these people, you had short clubs. Clubs were very popular. That being, we'll say, essentially billy clubs. Saps were very popular, being rock or bearing filled leather pouches that you could strike with. A lot of little things like that. Shady survival techniques. Now you get, if you stayed in that for a long time, you might encounter garrotes and choking and severing devices. They've been around a lot longer than anybody wants to admit. And you could go way back in Hindustani Indian times and get all the way to the Thuggis who ritually assassinated people traveling the rivers as a sacrifice to Kali. Short, ugly combat happened a lot, but that, much like what the rapier, very largely was later, was civilian. And why are these all small things? Why are these all small weapons? One, easier to acquire. Two, easier to hide. And three, most people in America have no concept of how close quarters a lot of the fighting was. In fact, a lot of people in the world today don't really understand how close quarters things were in earlier eras. I will make some exceptions, being Israel springs immediately to mind. And what do we have out of Israel? We have some of the finest submachine guns. In modern times, we have Krav Maga, which is a very, very aggressive, close-in combat style that's designed to function in narrow quarters with a bold, simple aggression, gross motor movements and things, which is way out down the line, but we have to understand. Rex says, screw the door, breach the wall. Absolutely. And aiming down the arrow ends with me with the bad shot. If you've learned instinctual aiming from just doing it for a long time, you learned it, one, because you had to, and two, if you were allowed to, or you were a poacher, that arrow meant dinner or starvation. Okay? And that mentality goes all the way through to at least the Great Depression in America. A family story of mine is my grandfather was handed the 22 rifle and given 5 bullets and told, come back with 5 rabbits or don't come back. And he'd have to sleep out on the prairie. These were hard times made for hard people. The Middle Ages are no different, and certainly the Renaissance, again, no different. Hunting had practical, because in hunting, you're dealing with moving targets, some of which may be a threat to you. So they had to know archery. Now they get drafted. They've been pulled in, drafted, conscripted. Maybe they volunteered to learn. What are they going to learn? Okay. A lot of that, is built on their previous education coming in, their social rank, physical capabilities. Everybody gets to know how to make a spear go, even before staff. They may have played with the staff with the family, and again, that's something they probably learned. Their father taught them the basics of staff. Again, for self-defense. It's like the military is not likely to teach you sling, but a lot of them knew how to use a sling. Military is going to hand you a spear. If you're really, if you're new and you're disposable, they're going to make a spear wall out of you. They're going to give you a pike, teach you how to couch it, And your job is to become basically a movable, stationary defense via intimidation and impalement. Pikes could get insanely long. 14 feet is nothing in range of pike. And that, for anybody who's actually held a stick like that, or trained with anything along those lines, that is a huge amount of leverage. That's a huge amount of weight. You have to be strong, so you anchor it to the side of your back foot, and you hold it there, and you hope that whoever's running at you gets impaled. Now, you're looking at little or no armor, basically whatever you brought. Using that, or the slightly better people would be equipped with a shorter spear and expected to, spear and poke and make things go. So you learn spear. You learn staff, but you learn staff for basically as a training tool. Because the thing about staff is if you learn staff properly, you learn spear and sword and actually knife to an extent. It's a very adaptable, fluidic, changing weapon. So you either come to it from the mentality of how I've never held a weapon, bam, 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 let's go. Staffs are beautiful because they give you reach, they hit hard. It's just, you put a pointy end on it, it becomes a spear, and that's really good because they're way over there. Now, from spear, you're probably going to learn either sword or mace/warhammer. And again, maces, warhammers, and one-handed axes are very simple to train compared to a sword, and they function much like the agricultural or industrial, for lack of a better word, tools that people already knew how to make this go. You went from, so I've never swung a sword, to I've been a blacksmith since I was wee. Okay. We're going to teach you some new ways to swing it. And, we'll put a shield in the other hand, and we'll teach you the basics of that. Remembering that the shield is a weapon. I'm going to say that again. The shield is a weapon. They did not learn passive shield work as a rule. They learned aggressive shield work, depending, again, on the period and type of shield. But you're going to punch out with that shield if nothing else is available. You're going to shield bash with it. There's a lot of things that can be done. It's an adaptive, fluid thing. But why would they learn spear and axe and, mace? What's the big difference? Why not sword? Why aren't more people learning sword? Because from a practical aspect, the making of a polearm, which is, an axe or a hammer on the end of a spear, usually, you have a spearhead and something, or just something, because a battle axe does not look like, if I say battle axe, most people are going to envision the same thing. And I could go get one of the trainers, but I'm not going to walk that far. They envision something that looks, and this is really hazard, quick, but looks like a short double-bladed axe. It might have bearding because, a bearded axe is cool, but something that looks like this. No, that is not what battle axes look like. Battle axes look much more. Please don't fall everything. Aha! Stay. Cool. They were shaped like this. Now, they were probably a bit bigger than this. This is a mouse hawk head. But a lot of times, not much bigger than this. So you would have something like what would be considered a focus, shepherd's axe. 3-foot pole, 4-foot pole, little axe on the head. Why is it a little axe? Because you have to be able to swing it all day, over and over and over and over again. You have to move it quickly and agilely. You cannot do that with a great heavy weapon. The other factor is simple economics. A lot of pikes were literally just blackened, hardened wood tip spikes. They don't have metal or anything on the end. You get a big old long one, you basically chop down saplings, cut the limbs off, sharpen the little end, put it in the fire so the wood is hardened and it's a little preserved, and you pass them out because we don't really have mass production as we think of it yet. And yes, Foxy hits the next point. Money. Metal was expensive. It's expensive. It takes time. Okay? So you really had to earn your way towards a sword. Okay? Had to earn your way towards a big knife. That's a lot of metal if you didn't buy or bring one yourself. Likewise, we could go down the same path with armor. So, what would they train? Staff, spear, the agricultural tools that they knew, and then you get into sword, and possibly you eventually get into greatsword, if that's both temporally and geographically appropriate. Now you also have to remember, and I have to hammer this down, these swords are side arms. Swords are not primary weapons. Swords are the pistols of their era by and far. There are exceptions. Your arming sword coupled with a shield was a very standard arrangement. But so was mace and shield and axe and shield. You're going to have weapon and shield. If swords are aplenty, you're going to have that. If you don't have anything, clubs are a beautiful thing. Short sticks, short staves. You learn how to get go. Single stick, shillelagh, all that fun stuff. And staff, oftentimes, especially in Europe, was thought much more like greatsword and spear than the half. When you think staff, most people think a half. Let me get something vaguely staff-like. Okay, so my anything trainer here is if you put this length on either end, it becomes a staff. So I don't need that for my purpose. But most people think staff, and they're thinking these motions, which are beautiful. However, there were a lot of this where you're wielding it just like you would a long sword. Okay? Couching it, like spearing with it, wheeling with it. There's a lot of that. If you look into Irish, I think it's Irish staff fighting is something that's been preserved fairly well, but it got kind of limited for a while. You'll find the motions used look a lot like Lacan, the French stick fighting systems, but more aggressive. Now, it's interesting to understand that because that's going to tell you a lot about the culture, about what's available, what people have. The sword primarily was a noble's or a noble's weapon and those in service. So, you've got the basic format. The Lord of the Castle was probably a knight of some sort, or at least has been trained in knightly arts. Then it goes down to, let me just put it this way. I completely agree. However, and I will put a caveat, in modern times, when you look at the number of hours it takes a craftsman to hand make a sword. Now, I'm not talking about anything mass produced. I'm talking about handmade sword. Fair market value for the labor to do it, given the skill sets needed, that makes sense economically. Why anybody, from a supply demand thing. Why most people would want to pay that, I think, is ridiculous, but that's a whole nother thing. And I agree, Kitty. I don't have that kind of discretionary money. Even if I did, well, actually, if I did, I would be custom. It would not be anything like most people think. It would be very carefully customized. There are a couple people, and some of the medals I would request are superb. I have some connections with a couple people in Texas who would be able to hook me up, and even if it's not something that they standardly make, that's one of those where throwing money is worth it. But I've kind of devoted my entire adult life to the training and teaching of swordsmanship, so that's a whole different thing. All that aside for now, you have your sword. But again, depending on where you are, that's a sidearm. Spear is much better because spear pokes the guy way over there. Lance is sort of a mutated spear if we're getting into cavalry, which we're really not. We're not going to get much into cavalry because then you get into horse bows and other things. And you do get into war bows of obscene poundage with truly ludicrous penetration abilities. But says, depending on the maker, you're paying for the name. I know several sword sellers who get their steel from the same sword, but use vastly different prices. Yes, buyer beware. That being said, you learn sword, but again, vast majority of the time, they were not until you get towards the end where knights as a recreational activity, as some tournaments for honor and all the stuff were going on, those I think were put up more as a start of social control to permeate a sense of honor in the combatants, to keep them calmer during peacetime. Because believe it or not, throughout the whole history of human existence that's been tracked anyway, there is a problem in taking someone, training them to be a soldier, conditioning them, training them to engage threats with deadly force, and then pulling back and having them have to function as a civilian. Very strange things happen. And in like during the feudal states periods in Japan, you had the samurai who were kept poor very deliberately to keep them tied to the masters of the land so that they wouldn't be so likely to uprise. They still did occasionally, but because warfare takes money, usually. They were expected at that time to test their steel, and they would do that on peasants or on people they were passing, on each other sometimes. So there was a lot of honor for the base of honor, but also as an excuse to oh, you have offended my honor, let's go, because they need to test and prove that they're deadly. There was that sort of thing was going on in the Middle Ages in Europe, and they're like, whoa, 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 guys, we must embrace, and this is the first, I don't want to say the first perversion of combat, but first perversion of the perception of what medieval combat was. Started with codes of chivalry, which were very different than what a lot of people think about. You have to understand that fighting was long, it was brutal, it was disgusting, not only from the basics of sweating and blood, guts, and veins in your teeth, but from the fact that no one could just go, hold it, I need to go take a potty break. So people were defecating in their pants left, right, and center. So battles became rapidly muddy, rancid, nightmarish things that made conditions worse. This is not something anybody who is in our time period wants any piece of unless they're really warped. But yes, they learned the sword. And again, in we have to delineate between the medieval period, very heavy, and the what fell out? Oh, my stick. Uh, the Renaissance period. Because when you get to the Renaissance period, things get a little more a little different. Sword study is more available to the masses. Weapons have evolved because um, firearms have made most types of armor impractical. Now, excuse me, most late period armorers, when they sold a breastplate, the good ones had a ding in the breastplate that they were selling because they'd already shot it with a musket or something. And remember, the greatest swordsman in the West that people, a group of trained swordsmen that people think of, thanks to Alexander Dumas, Alexander Dumas, are the Three Musketeers. However, no, they were not the three fencers. They were the Three Musketeers, meaning that their musket was considered their primary weapon, unless they were grenadiers, meat dudes, early mortars and artillery. Yes, please. But the sword became a secondary sidearm because pistols and all these weapons were still fairly unreliable, certainly by modern standards. But they also weren't outside of cartridges, black powder is very funny. It's unstable. It doesn't always like to work things. It can get wet real easy. It can be a very problematic thing. Great for one shot if it works, but there's a very good chance it won't. So again, your sidearm would need a sidearm. Plus, getting into expense. Guns were more expensive than swords, largely. Now, sword's a different thing. Because they weren't trying to hack through armor, and because basically people had been studying the sword for a few hundred, sometimes 1,000 years, it has evolved into something lighter and more efficient. Well, relatively lighter. A lot of times, because people get confused, an arming sword and a rapier were roughly the same weight. People get rapiers and fencing foils confused. They are not the same. The difference was the balance and the use. So it became a more studied art. Because it was a more studied art, it was taught. And then you go to the slide and find a sword master, and you would learn single sword. And the funny thing is, defining a rapier gets real weird because there's a lot of different languages, and most of the translations boil down to a sword. So you have to look at how it's used to make sure you're using the right kind. And it gets all sorts of delightfully odd tricks and tweaks. In warfare, two-handed swords are still fairly popular. They're still of devastating use, but they're very inconvenient in civilian life. Practicality. In modern terms, it's not very practical if you're carrying a firearm for self-defense to carry a full-length rifle everywhere you go. We've got this. I knew a guy who, in one of my kung fu classes, who argued with me that the rapier was not properly balanced because it was heavier than his fencing foil. He was convinced that historical fencers were the same size and weight as a foil. Do you know how easy it is to break a foil? No. They were much stouter than a foil. Um, they did evolve or devolve, depending on who you talk to, allegedly and kind of parallel into small swords towards the end. Again, because it was more convenient to carry. And again, physical strength comes in because if you're not doing physical labor all the time, you're weaker. You're not going to be comfortable carrying a heavier sword. It just starts to make sense. So, daintier weapons for, frankly, daintier people. That gives us this really neat bit of weirdness where people who were brought up in the military and advanced through the ranks to a certain amount, as much as their social class would let them, very late in period, in the sword period. So we're talking 1800s. They carried sabers because a saber is a monstrously effective, relatively easy to learn, heavy weapon. But the style is very different than, relatively heavy weapon, than foil. That's why saber cuts different. We could ask Rex all about that. We could talk about it for days. Now, modern fencing foils and modern fencing sabers are not at all like their real steel. Wow, my stomach's just making noise. Compatriots. But it brought a problem. And the problem is this. Most of the officers were taught the tactics and things theoretically. They were rich, but they did not learn saber. They didn't have the muscle memory to use them. So you had this problem of officers being pretty easy to kill if you could get in on them. So you get, sorry about that, you get the concept of what can we do? Well, they all learned foil fencing. Well, that's useless. So they designed a weapon that tried to be sturdy enough to hold up to saber combat and bayonet combat. Because remember, the spear has not gone away. Let's stop that one right there. The spear has not ever gone away. The soldier loves the spear. It's why they still fix bayonets. What is a rifle? Well, it's a really complicated spear shaft. And when it runs out of freedom pellets, you put a pointy stick on the end, and it becomes a spear. And we can make spears go. So, let's see. He took fencing somewhere else before coming here. His foil looked like a car antenna with rubber wrapped around it for grip. I've seen weapons that look like that. It gets complex. Now, I'm not bashing the foil, both as a training tool and as a sport in any way, shape, or form. You want to know what the fastest thing outside of the bullets in the decathlon are in the Olympics? The speed of a fencing foil. It is monstrously fast. Making sure that the message coming in. And there's an image, and I think I know what image it is. Yep. Last time sword carried into combat zone, that's Afghanistan. They're still carried. Interesting choice, too. I know that sword. That's the remake of the Spartan sword. I'll remember its name as soon as it hits me. But I don't know if I'm allowed to show this or not, so I'm not going to without confirmation due to situations. But yeah, they're still carried today. Don't get me wrong. Swords are beautiful if you don't have a lot of body armor to work around. And short, practical swords are very practical. Oh, go for it. Okay, cool. Let me see if I can get to show. There we go. This is from Afghanistan. And yes, that appears to be an American soldier carrying a sword on his back. Now, I'm not terribly fond of a backdraw, but that's short enough you could pull it off. It's canted enough that you can pull it off. And frankly, anywhere else he would carry it would interfere with his standard issue kit. You're going to hear something you almost never have heard from me. I almost wish it was never meant to be drawn. Okay, that's going to say it's carried due to the culture, and that makes sense. It's one of the few times I can see having a backdraw. I hate backdraws, backscabbers, but that's at least functional. And it's interesting because there have been several cases of people being penned down. I believe it was some British in Afghanistan, and they ran out of ammunition, so they fixed bayonets and did a charge. It might be the last bayonet charge in history thus far, but their attackers fled because on a primal level, they understood what a bayonet is, what a spear is. And I do find it fascinating. I do also support the idea of cultures that require being armed at all times. I think that's just practical. Adults who don't have knives on them fundamentally bother me. That's neither here nor there. Back to practical training-ish stuff. But, and again, that's about machete length. I mean, that's a very practical thing. It was 04 by some British Highlanders in Iraq. That makes sense. That because I'm like the armor pattern, the camouflage pattern didn't quite look right to me. The setup just didn't look right. Let me see. Okay, that wasn't him. That was okay. That's something else. But I understand that. Warrior culture is a fascinating thing. So we get back to the 1800s. The officers were not muscle memory able to use a saber. You could teach them, but they didn't have the time behind it. They didn't have the physicality for a saber, the gross muscle things. Oh, I understand, and I understand the choice. I just, from my sense, the practicality of having a knife at all times just makes sense to me. You know, this is the first thing I put on in the morning. This and my glasses. Well, not this pair. This pair lives in here, but whistles and I have a sword within arm's reach of me and 16 others scattered throughout my apartment. Because of my son, I don't quite have that array set up currently, and we'll leave it at that. But rewinding, they couldn't, so they developed the spadroon. And the spadroon's an interesting weapon because it didn't do anything very well, but it did a lot of things. And wow, cats make good weapons too. I mean, technically, yes. And hello. I'm glad you caught it. And yes, especially if thrown, but please don't throw my cats. They sort of worked. They weren't great. The evolution of the sword in America is fascinating. I encourage you to look into that. I think the last design of the combat issued sword, not ceremonial, was designed by then Lieutenant George S. Patton. I have his book. Part of me thinks I should have Rommel's book so I can say I read your book, you magnificent. Anyway, learning. I mean, that speaks to something that we need to remember and address. You have to train in weapons that work for you. Now, I am big on trying different things. So when I get somebody who can learn, yep, the NCO sword is the oldest weapon in continued service in the United States Army. And I have had people who have offered to purchase military swords for me or give them to me, and I've politely declined because I have not served and I don't feel it would be appropriate for me to have anything like that unless it was, displayed on a wall with their name on it, be it a relative or something like that. It's not something I would be comfortable carrying because I am a civilian. And I take that to perhaps excess sometimes, but I prefer my rules. Now, going all the way back to what should you learn, because we're at the hour. I want to break things down, and I'm going to remind you guys of the list of standard melee weapons you should learn. A lot of this was actually influenced by the SAS handbook I read and a few other things. So you should learn, if you're going to go into weaponry, you need to understand how to make a knife go. I'll break that down from small knife to large knife. They are two very different weapons. You need to learn 1 meter stick and 2 meter stick, which 1 meter stick is 3 foot or less in my mind. And that's where you're going to learn how to use short handle hammers, short sticks, short logs. Anything you encounter roughly in that, you use like that, or as like it's a sword without an edge. You'll single stick it. 2 meter is your staff or spear length. And again, you train them to use them basically both the same ways. You learn a mass weapon. Understand how mass weapons work. Mass weapons are hammers, axes, and yes, maces, plus anything that can be improvised or acquired of that. A knotted club. Technically, a lot of the blackthorn shillelaghs are closer in function to mass weapons than they are to stick because they have that knotted ball of root. I've seen there are a couple southern trees that give a very good knot, very strong ball that you can clean up and use to make walking sticks and the like with that. But because the extra weight is there, it handles more what I consider a mass weapon. Likewise, ripping up a portion of the concrete that holds down a stop sign. I have seen that done in a fight where someone ripped a stop sign out of the ground and swung it at somebody. Ignoring the sign portion, they went with the heavy end first. It was interesting, but they were interesting people. I don't know the results of that because I left. Again, I made what's called a tactical advance to the rear. But know how to use that. Let me see. Short knife, long knife, 1 meter stick, 2 meter stick, mass weapon. Those are your standard weapons. Now you're going to get into flails. Modern flails are belt combat. I would put things like what Kitty does as exotic weapons. So rope dart is an exotic weapon. I wouldn't go trying to use a rope dart as a defensive weapon if you have any other choice without training, because you're more likely with any flail weapon to hurt yourself than the other guy. Without training. But these are the 5 categories you need to know. You also need to know, and it's something the guild, for safety reasons, I have not talked a lot about, and I don't instruct. It's one of those, I know how to do a large amount of it, but I don't instruct it because I don't have the means to do it safely. And that's what I call integrated combat. Okay? When you get into the actual hardcore study of combat, not fencing or sparring or most of the fun things we do, you have to keep your unarmed combat aspects integrated with your melee weapon aspects, integrated with your firearms aspects. And this goes all the way back. They had to do something like this all the way back to the musketeers, to archers. You know, what happens when you're out of arrows and they close in on you? You're fighting with your knife, your legs, your arms. You're doing a lot. And there was a lot more of that. I mean, we have plankration all the way back to ancient Greece. So there have been martial arts systems, but many times again they were so ubiquitous and so often family oriented that they weren't recorded, in part because you wouldn't want somebody finding a book, your playbook of how you're going to defend yourself. That could be very problematic for somebody when real life is on the line. But you have to understand, when the fight hits, it's not I'm knife fighting. Oh, I'm unarmed. No. There's grapples for the weapons. There's disarmaments. It gets ugly and brutal, and you need the right background. Now, the consensus for unarmed combat, especially if you're looking at it from an MMA standpoint, is you need the 3 pillars. Okay, you need something to handle striking. You need something to handle grappling or wrestling, and you need something to handle kicking. So for a long time, that was Greco-Roman wrestling. What you think of Olympic-style wrestling, boxing, and then kickboxing was basically it, or karate would come in. But you'd integrate these 3 things to make the pillars to hold you up. Modern systems of martial arts combat, at least the ones I have studied, have all 3 of those pillars integrated into a single style that is distilled enough that it is designed to be able to be taught to the dumbest of the dumb. And I hate to put it that way because it sounds insulting, but it's not. Because you have to look, an army is a factory that has to mass produce functional soldiers. They don't all have to be the best. They don't have the time or the function to do that, but they have to mass produce and teach in large numbers simultaneously in a very short amount of time, optimally as short as possible, as deadly and effective a martial system as possible. And that's where you get things like MCMAP, the Marine Corps Martial Arts Program. Incredibly brutal. You get the 5-point style that the late period Chinese military had. Very simple, effective, functional, and understand that that's only if a whole lot of things have gone wrong. There were periods in wartime in America, for example, where they cut out a lot of the hand-to-hand training because they didn't have time. And at one point, when my dad was going through, he asked him about that. I said, "We don't have time to teach you that." And the Marine who was teaching my dad how to shoot said, "I've been personally guaranteed by the Secretary of the Navy, the Secretary of the United States Navy, that you will have enough bullets that you won't need this." And Dad said, to his credit, that was never a problem. So you have to look at that. But it becomes diminishing results. There are people who have the capacity to be much more complex, autonomous. I'm looking for a word that isn't going to immediately be cliche, but operators, people who become special forces members. And the more you have certain abilities and certain skill sets, and most importantly, certain mindsets, assuming you pass the physicalities of it all, the relentless drive never to give up and do things, the more it's cost effective to train you in more advanced techniques and shady things. So that's how you get the elites. And there will always be elites, warriors, soldiers, whatever you want to use the term. I'm using lowercase s when I say soldier to keep, if I were referring to Americans, I would say servicemen or servicewomen, I think. But, you get that's everybody. But the amount of training is what you're good at. Now, I do. Oh, God. My internet might be getting a little shady again. I do briefly want to get into archery in the Middle Ages because there were 3 tiers of archery. I was asked to discuss this. And there are 3 types of archery you need to know and the bows that were behind them. You had survival sustenance archery. These were what called birding bows. And just like we're not allowed to carry certain types of firearms in America, despite issues, I have some opinions on that. In England, you couldn't. You're expected to train in archery, but many times it was in lighter bows that were enough impact to kill a bird, but you couldn't poach the king's deer. And by not being able to poach the king's deer, it made it really hard to shoot somebody to death with a birding bow. Then you had what I consider standard bows. Standard bows, these are still high, relatively high poundage, very strong bows, but they were used primarily for volley fire, wherein a whole bunch of archers would stand in a line and either over a wall or simply across a field over their own troops. Blessed is a shield wall when you are an archer or a spearman. You're going to go, we want that area hit. And it was accuracy through volume. If you throw enough arrows at that area, people are going to die. So that's what they did. Then you get into actual, what we would consider when we think of archery today, when we think of combative archery. These are the people who are looking for a specific target, and they are, taking that target in an aimed manner. They may be firing instinctually, but they're picking their targets. Pop, 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 pop. These are the type of people who would be positioned on top of walls. These are the type of people who would be involved in siege engines guarding out. This is something that evolved heavily into the role of the crossbowman, actually, because whereas archers could volley fire incredibly quickly, I mean, you start to get one locomotive. So I think it was like 2.5 arrows per second when they're the ones who had really great rate of fire. If you broke it down their rate per minute, it's been a while since I looked at the numbers, but they could get this stuff done. That's where rapidity. That's where the Battle of Hastings. You get this stuff, but targeted archery was a different thing. Now, that's what made the crossbow so nice, because you weren't under tension. You weren't having to hold that massive weight. So you get an experience much closer to modern marksmanship. Being, you pick the target, control your breathing, squeeze the trigger. Now, the trigger may be shaped radically different, and fire. Now, the reloading process, depending on the type of crossbow, was either loop it under your foot, bodily pull the string back and go, or if it was a heavy crossbow, you're looking at something like an incorporated or external windlass, where you're cranking these cranks to wind up a hook that pulls the bowstring into the notch into position. Both of these, compared to longbow or shortbow, are incredibly time consuming. Now, there is another style that has to be discussed, and that is archery from horseback. Yes, I will get into the Mongols briefly, because a Mongol recurve, the recurve technology allowed for stronger, shorter draw bows. And they were laminate bows. So they had different materials that behaved differently to allow more force to come out. Do not mistake the simplicity of application to a lack of complexity of design. They had to study their materials to get it to do what they wanted. It's a fascinating thing to look into. They also shot from horseback. They did things different. This all was made possible by one of the greatest inventions known to man that revolutionized combat, that being stirrups. Because for a long time, you get on a horse, you wear a saddle, but there were no little loops to put your feet in, so you had to hold on. But once you got into a saddle with stirrups, put your feet in, your arms are now relatively free to do what you want. And then you can either hip control the horse or, depending on how you're working the reins, that's fine. But this made for lightning fast perspective, again, in perspective of the era, troops. And if you want to see a really interesting combat where you see mounted archery used to great effect, look at the campaigns of Saladin during the Crusades. Fascinating stuff. Look at the tactics. Look at what they did. I want to encourage you guys, when it's cold, if you physically can't fight, fine. Mentally fight. Educate yourself on tactics and strategies. What worked, what didn't. Just because, modern weapons negate a lot of that for practicality does not mean in the absence of modern weapons, they would not be good skills to have. So I want to encourage you guys to look that sort of thing up. Sorry, I don't normally have this on, but I've been kind of taking care of somebody, so I have to be a little one of our own, Stephanie. We've talked to her that she goes by different names in different places, but I'm going to say Steph to keep it simple. May have had a heart attack a while ago, and they're trying. She's having to do sudden dramatic life changes to not die. And being me, I have to keep my phone active because I take care of people. My apology is only from the basis of I hate that it seems rude. However, it's of a priority where it is necessary. But you want to train. Let's break it down. Understanding how to use the 5 basic melee weapons is good, because then you can start to recognize them in your surroundings. And that's how you get to where you can start to understand improvisational weapons, because improvising with a weapon is a lot simpler when you can realize basically what context the weight balance, the reach, the weight, and the balance give you. So let me grab something that isn't a weapon around here, which is much harder than you would think, that I can hold up and explain. Oh, most of the mobile items are intentionally weapons. Oh, you have things you throw. There are things you throw too. That is basically throw a rock, throw a ball, throw a spear. But, okay, I'm not going to pull out, but if I grab my power extension cord over here, or here we go. Weaponizing something like this. Now, I'm not going to lengthen it because that would make it much, much weaker. But This is basically a short club. I'm going to smack with it, aim for the soft bits. I'm aiming for the same basic areas, and I'll talk about that in another video, because there are places that are better to hit than others, obviously. But you've got strikes. You can pump down strike with it. There's a lot of options here. It's metal. It's relatively stout. The reach isn't good, but I don't want to break it, adjust it to have more reach, because it would significantly weaken it. Still, I could put the bonk on somebody pretty easily with this, using a mix of short knife techniques, because you can stab with a blunt weapon. It just won't poke through. You can still do devastating effect. Play with that in your mind. And when you start to see it, you'll be able to figure out, oh, I can use this way. And the more weapons you train in, the more items you will realize can be used as weapons. So I hope this covers a bit of what thesis that we're asking about. You want me to flirt with a little bit of archery. I wanted to do some survey stuff. Ordinal, you got a little bit of the ordinal and different ways it was done. For my case, for safety and for the fact of interest, I teach basically single stick first. Because if you look at what an SSO is, sword simulating object, it's basically single stick. How to use a stick like a sword and effectively make it go like a stick. From there, we go through their interests and what's safest to do. So if we're going into the fencing field, it goes learn single rapier, train that. And this is a lot left over from my SCA days, but it's not stuff I disagree with. You can go the multiple weapons category, where you go sword and dagger, and then sword and case of rapiers, so two swords. I'm not saying that any of these styles are inherently better than the others, but it's the way I teach. I got my meds beforehand. Thank you. I will need to stop for some other things. And Rex says, learn single, master single, reject multiple weapon. And there is nothing wrong with that. I'm going by student interest. I do see the people who devote themselves to single as that's very close to the Bruce Lee, I fear the guy who knows 10,000, who does one kick 10,000 times, not knows 10,000 styles. Because I learned the styles to be able to teach the styles to the people who weren't being able to learn the styles from the people who should have taught them. Oh, no. I mean, I know you're teasing, but you made a great point, Rex. But, okay, that gives you your edge weapons. To the other side, you have rigid, you have shield or buckler. Oh, okay, you have rigid and non-rigid defensive devices. And from that, you get, from the rigid, you have shield, strap shield or buckler, and stick. Now, I do like stick because stick can be trained very effective if you are using a sword cane. So you're using both halves. If you have a rugged enough sheath, that gives you a secondary weapon, if that's your jam, especially if you deal with multiple opponents. Multiple opponents and single sword gets a little dicey. It's fun, but it gets dicey. And remember that if you have that open hand, it should still be doing things. If you absolutely have to get it out of the way, get it out of the way. But that means you have the opportunity to grab things, grab them, grab their weapon, grab scenery. Always fight like a Sith. Do not be afraid to throw scenery at people. And learn left and right hand. Anything you can do ambidextrous, you want to do ambidextrous. But, and then non-rigid. And non-rigid usually is some type of cloak that can be used basically either the distraction I'm swirling it around to disguise my movements. You know, a hunt hand disguise where cloak and dagger, they can't see where the dagger is. They may not realize the dagger is there until it's too late. Always optimal. If you have to engage someone, engage them in a situation where you will win. Victory conditions. Then you have the other way of fighting cloak, which is to basically use the cloak to, with a quick wrap around your arm. It will give you some slightly better slash protection, and that basically turns your arm into a shield with a bit of drag to protect your hands. Variants, of course, you can have, if you have reinforced gloves, especially with chainmail palms, you can just grab blades all day. Life is good. Hand parries happen. It annoys true single aficionados like Rex, but they are effective. I still prefer to keep the metal between the meat. Thank you very much. But what I prefer and what happens are not always the same things. There's also, while we're talking, double dagger. From the fencing category, while it's not registered as an actual style, fighting with two 18-inch bladed daggers, or what we consider short swords, is very much a style too, as is fighting with a single dagger or short sword. There aren't a lot of flexible knife trainers that are safe at the shorter distances, but and let's see. Well, I first did Boffer. Almost everyone I fought against had two weapons. I had one and beat most of them. Eventually made a pair of butterfly swords just to shut people up, which happens. It gets weird because if you're talking Boffer and in a more established group, which I have suspicions that yours wasn't, their conventions usually have an experience level means of you can only play with this weapon after you have this many experience points. It can be complex, but it's there. In something like the SCA, you have to be authorized a certain amount of time single, and I can't remember how much it was, and traditionally, and then you test competency in what's called an authorization bout, where they see if you can fight the style safely. Some people get confused of safe versus effective, but all in all, you should be moderately effective and definitely as safe as possible, and that's how you get through that. And there was, a relative tech tree there, but again, it goes into what you need to know how to do. And fencing does not traditionally allow mass weapons, but I do love them, so I know how to make those go. Any of the above, at one point or another, I was off. I had a full off card in the SCA at the time I had it. They added a couple other styles that I didn't have because they weren't available at the time. But from what I've seen, I would be able to authorize them with little trouble, unless they got very. You have to be using this exact style. They kind of got pot arms on that, where it's not how effective you are. It's, are you keeping in the style you have selected? So if you're going to say, I'm going to fight in Gigante, you have to stay in Gigante stances and fight like you're in, you're using that style. Fabris, whatever. But the best option I find is to have a rudimentary. I'm a generalist, and I'm extreme generalist. It's just who and what I am. I like to know just enough to be functional at nearly everything, so that I can make anything go if I need to. And then once I've established enough of that in a given interest, I find myself falling into what feels most comfortable and going from there. So you have to combine practicality with, frankly, interest in what we do. And by training in that, from that attitude, you gain a lot. Everyone should train in perception. Everyone should train in situational and tactical analysis. more than anything, you want to be able to understand and read a situation as quickly and accurately as possible, because you need to know, am I at a disadvantage? Am I in a place where I could get jumped? Situational awareness. Are you paying attention? If you train in nothing else, and this goes to Miss Saren if she's still around, if you're going to be unarmed, I have no problem with that. You triple down on perception. Perception, but wisdom was my dump stat. Oh, Rex, I love you. But, and I know you're sharp. Learning to pay attention and do and understand the situation will prevent the conflict before it happens the vast majority of the time. And anytime you can prevail without having to engage in a conflict is the highest level of tactical function. The fight you don't need to engage in and still meet your goals is the ultimate win, folks. So, I've got an hour and a half. I want to thank you guys for a lively and informative and on-topic chat. I hope that was interesting. Now, remember, tomorrow at 6:30 Central Time, I believe, our own Bladed Thesis will be doing his bi-weekly show, The Tea House, where he talks about Eastern martial arts and philosophies. I encourage you to look into that. I want to remind you, we are made possible both by all my fencing manuals and my fiction. Guys, don't sleep on my fiction, especially my latest book, which I have the hard copy here, Hates and Hellfire. Look at that. Yes, this was not a little volume. It is in large print because I don't want to squint at my own book. But with that, guys, thank you. If you want to support this channel, please hit like, share, make sure you're subscribed. If you really want to support this channel, consider becoming a Patreon member for as little as $1 a month. And just keep doing what you're doing, guys. So I'm going to ask you guys to keep your eyes open. Do your drills. If my gimpy self can throw 200 shots a night, which I do roughly, and I say roughly because usually I go over, but minimum is 200 shots a night in different guards, you can. Just start doing it, start going through. The very first video I ever shared is a walkthrough through the 9 guards. You start with whatever vague sword simulating object you have, or even without, just stick your thumb out and just practice and start learning. Whatever you have to do. But do your drills. Be kind to yourself and each other. And as always, friends, thank you. Support your local swordmaster. I will see you guys next week for another stunning episode of the Historical Fencing Guild's live stream. I'm not going to be able to do a lot of extracurricular, scripted videos for about another month because I am running a convention and I have to get everything for my booth set up and all the convention stuff set up, and that time crunches down because I'm trying to get through a few more of my publications so that I can have copies to sell. So work first, play later. But after that, we should have a good time. With that, guys, I will see you next time, and next time we'll probably check out if Purple Heart Armory has anything really spanky. Look over some new items that are on. I'm trying to decide what I want to order next to review for them and for you. And with that, guys, have a great night. Toodles.